I'm Claire Donovan, 29 years old, and on a gray Saturday morning, I walked into what I thought would be a simple family meeting. My mother sat at the kitchen table flipping pages she wasn't reading. My father stood at the window with his arms crossed, and my sister Lauren waited at the head of the table like she was presiding over a courtroom. No one said hello when I came in, not even a glance of welcome. When I finally sat down, Lauren slid a manila envelope in front of her and announced that my stay in our childhood home had gone on long enough. A few minutes later, she set a cardboard box of my belongings on the table and told me I didn't live there anymore. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove your worth when others doubted you. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Milwaukee where family dinners were expected to be cheerful, even if the air was thick with unspoken tension. From the beginning, Lauren was the one our parents praised. She won ribbons, earned perfect grades, and filled the house with certificates that hung in neat frames along the hallway. My mother loved retelling stories about her accomplishments, and my father nodded with steady pride. I was different, softer around the edges, more interested in the stories I scribbled in the margins of my school books than in school clubs or trophies. Where Lauren stood out in the spotlight, I was the one drifting quietly in the background. The only person who made me feel seen was my grandfather Henry. He had been a teacher all his life, and he loved walking with me through the neighborhood, asking about the worlds I was building in my journals. On my 10th birthday, he gave me a leather-bound notebook and told me to keep writing even if no one else understood. Those afternoons with him were the only times I felt like my imagination wasn't a flaw. Lauren never liked it. She would roll her eyes whenever he praised my work, and sometimes she whispered that stories wouldn't pay the bills. Still, I clung to his encouragement. It was the one place I found real approval. When he passed away during my college years, I lost more than a grandfather. I lost the only shield I had against the quiet comparisons that filled our home. Lauren delivered a polished eulogy that impressed everyone while I stood by unable to speak through tears. After the service, she hugged me and whispered that maybe now I would finally grow up. Those words stayed with me heavier than grief. From then on, every time my parents looked at me, I could sense their disappointment, even if they didn't speak it aloud. As the years went by, Lauren's path continued upward. Law school honors, prestigious internships, photographs of celebrations that seemed made for glossy magazines. My parents adored every step she took. Meanwhile, I struggled to keep afloat in small apartments, waiting tables, and sending out stories that were rarely accepted. I lived on little, but I held on to the hope that one day my words might matter. To them, though, my choices looked like wasted time. The distance between us widened with every passing year. So when I lost my job and my savings in the same cruel season, I made the one call I swore I never would. Lauren answered cool but agreeable and told me I could stay at the house for 3 months at most. I returned with 4 suitcases and a promise to myself that I would find stability. What I didn't see then was that I wasn't coming home at all. I was walking back into a place where the verdict had already been written. And that verdict became painfully clear the moment Lauren set that box in front of me at the so-called family meeting. Her words echoed in the silence. I had no home with them anymore. Growing up in our house, the contrast between me and my sister was never subtle. Lauren seemed to shine in every way that earned attention: straight A's, student council, piano recitals, and the perfect smile in every family picture. My parents displayed her ribbons in frames along the hallway and retold her achievements at every dinner with friends. Whenever neighbors stopped by, my mother would gesture proudly to the walls lined with certificates as if they told the story of who we were. My life did not decorate those walls. I was the child with scuffed shoes and ink smudges on her fingers, always scribbling in notebooks instead of practicing for the next big event. I was quiet in ways that made people uncomfortable. My mother often told me I lived too much in my head, and my father sighed whenever I asked for more paper or art supplies. They never called me a disappointment out loud, but I never felt like a source of pride either. The one person who seemed to understand was my grandfather, Henry. He had spent his life as a teacher and carried the patience of someone who saw potential in small things. He loved to tell stories while we walked through the neighborhood, his voice low and steady, full of worlds he never put on paper. He gave me my first leather-bound journal for my 10th birthday, telling me to fill it without fear. Those afternoons with him were the moments I felt like my imagination mattered, that it could take me somewhere beyond the silence I lived with inside our home. Lauren never liked the attention he gave me. She would walk by the porch where we sat together and mutter that writing wasn't real work. Sometimes she laughed as if it were a childish game. My grandfather always brushed her off, telling me it was better to create something than to pretend to know everything. It became an unspoken divide between us, one that grew sharper every year. When my grandfather passed away during my sophomore year of college, it felt as if the only bridge holding me up had collapsed. At his funeral, Lauren delivered a speech that brought nods from everyone listening. I couldn't manage more than a few words before breaking down in tears. Afterward, she hugged me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and whispered that maybe now I would finally grow up. Her words stayed with me longer than her embrace, leaving a mark that deepened over time. After that, I moved through the house as though carrying invisible bruises. My parents focused on Lauren's milestones while I kept to myself. She went off to law school, and their faces glowed with pride whenever her name came up in conversation. My mother described her Dean's List achievements to anyone who would listen, and my father spoke about her future as if it were already secure. When they turned to me, their voices softened with polite restraint. "Claire is still writing," they would say, as though it were something delicate, unimportant. I finished college with a degree in creative writing, a choice they never openly criticized, but never celebrated either. After graduation, I found a small apartment in Portland with 2 roommates. I worked evenings at a cafe and spent my days sending out stories to magazines that rarely wrote back. I stretched paychecks to cover rent and skipped meals so I could afford printer ink. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. When I had my first short story accepted in a tiny literary journal, I emailed my mother the news. She never replied. Weeks later, when I brought it up, she said I should think about something more stable. Lauren's world looked different. Photos of champagne glasses and polished courtrooms filled her social media feeds. She clerked for a federal judge and joined a law firm in Chicago that treated her like she was destined for greatness. My parents shared every update with their friends, their voices brimming with admiration. Eventually, I muted her stories online. The comparison became too heavy to carry. Still, I kept my distance and survived on my own for nearly 5 years. I told myself I would never go back. But life closed in faster than I could keep up. The magazine I freelanced for cut its budget. The cafe where I worked reduced my shifts. Then my relationship ended with the person I thought I might build a future with. He said I was always lost in my own world, that he needed someone more grounded. Within weeks, I fell behind on rent. My savings evaporated, and credit cards filled the gap until they couldn't anymore. When the notices arrived and the calls from the landlord grew sharper, I broke the promise I had made to myself. I dialed home. Lauren picked up. Her tone was measured, maybe distracted, but she didn't hesitate. She said I could come back, though, only for 3 months. I agreed before I could second-guess the offer. I packed my belongings into 4 suitcases and bought a one-way ticket back to Wisconsin. Walking through the front door of that house was nothing like I had imagined. The air smelled the same, the rooms looked familiar, but the warmth I remembered from childhood was gone. No one embraced me, no one welcomed me back. Instead, Lauren handed me a typed sheet of rules. No guests' curfew on common spaces, contributions toward utilities, chores detailed with dates and times. She spoke with the formality of a landlord setting boundaries for a tenant. My parents said little, and I carried my bags upstairs in silence. The bedroom I returned to was no longer mine. It had become a storage space filled with boxes stacked along the walls. I pushed them aside to make room for my suitcases. Meals at the table were quiet, broken only by my mother's faint comments about me finding practical work or my father's mumbled acknowledgments of Lauren's schedule. I told myself it was temporary, that I would get back on my feet. But every day felt heavier than the one before, as if I was carrying not just my own struggles, but the weight of being unwanted. Lauren kept her distance most of the time, though her words slipped out like little cuts. When she saw me working on my laptop, she asked if I was still writing my little blog. If I mentioned a project, she reminded me it wasn't the kind of work people respected. The irony was that I was trying harder than ever, applying to jobs, pitching to publishers, even signing on for small editing projects online. None of it seemed to matter. In that house, every effort was invisible. I lasted nearly 2 months like that, caught between determination and exhaustion. I wanted to prove I could still build a life outside their expectations, but the walls of that house made it impossible to breathe. My place at the table no longer felt like family. It felt like trespassing. And just when I thought I might hold out a little longer, the conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke open. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally surfaced over something as small as the thermostat. One cold night, I turned the heat up to 72. I was shivering trying to work on my laptop in the living room. 20 minutes later, Lauren appeared, arms folded tight across her chest. She demanded to know if I thought we needed to heat the entire house just for me. Her tone was clipped sharp enough to leave me fumbling for words. I told her it wasn't extreme, that I was cold and had only raised it a couple of degrees. She scoffed, accusing me of being entitled and thoughtless, pointing out that I wasn't the one paying the bills. The remark stung because I was contributing as much as I could, picking up remote editing jobs and small projects for a bookstore, just to scrape together a few $100s. None of it seemed to matter in her eyes. The argument escalated quickly. I said I was trying, that I had been sending out applications, and doing everything I could to move forward. She cut me off, laughing bitterly, and told me my life was nothing but excuses dressed up as creativity. The words landed with a weight heavier than I expected. I stood up, my pulse hammering in my chest, and told her she had no idea how hard I had worked just to survive. Her reply was sharper still. She reminded me that I was the one who had come crawling back into a house I didn't contribute to, living under the roof of people who actually had goals. It wasn't just the words that hurt, but the certainty with which she spoke them. She believed every syllable. I felt something inside me crack, the years of quiet cuts, finally adding up to a wound too deep to ignore. My voice shook when I said it. I told her she had hated me since we were children because our grandfather had chosen to believe in me. I told her it wasn't about money or bills or rules. It was about jealousy, about the attention she never forgave him for giving me. For a moment, her expression faltered, her eyes widening just slightly before she pushed it all back behind a practiced smile. She told me I was delusional, and with that she ended the argument. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, and said she was finished wasting energy on me. Then she delivered the words that made my stomach turn. "We'll settle this tomorrow. There's going to be a family meeting." Her tone wasn't casual. It sounded rehearsed final, as if the outcome had already been decided. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked away, leaving me rooted in place. That night I sat on the couch long after the lights were out, trembling with a mix of anger and fear. I replayed the exchange again and again, searching for some way I might have turned it differently. The more I thought about it, the more I realized it didn't matter. She had already drawn her conclusion, and she was going to make sure everyone else followed her lead. The house was too quiet to sleep in, but my body was too drained to move. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how she could twist my struggles into evidence against me, wondering how my parents would respond when she presented her case in front of them. A part of me wanted to believe they would stop her, that my father would tell her she was being cruel, or that my mother would stand up and insist that family meant more than convenience. But deep down, I already knew what tomorrow would bring. By morning, the silence of the house carried a different weight. I came downstairs expecting stiff greetings or half-hearted attempts at normalcy. Instead, I found the dining table cleared, except for 3 glasses of water and a notepad. Lauren sat at the head of the table again, dressed as if she were about to argue in front of a judge. My parents were on either side of her, their expressions tight, as though bracing for something unpleasant. No one said good morning. My mother's eyes flicked down at the glass in front of her, and my father rubbed the bridge of his nose like he was already exhausted. Lauren motioned for me to sit. I lowered myself into the chair, my heart beating harder with every second. She spoke first, her voice measured professional. She said it had become clear that this living arrangement wasn't working for anyone. I tried to respond, my words stumbling out in pieces. I reminded her I had been applying for jobs, that I was freelancing and keeping my end of the bargain. She listened without blinking, then accused me of refusing help and continuing to play the victim. The accusation left me speechless. Before I could gather myself, she stood up and brought out a cardboard box I hadn't noticed before. She placed it in front of me inside a collection of my belongings she had gathered from around the house. Her words were steady, each one landing like a stone. "You don't live here anymore. You have no home with us." I turned toward my parents, desperate for something, anything that would show they disagreed. My mother blinked rapidly but said nothing. My father finally spoke, his tone flat, as if repeating a decision already agreed upon. He said it was probably for the best. I looked down at the box, at the pieces of my life reduced to a few scattered items, and felt the air leave the room. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but my voice wouldn't rise past a whisper. I told them they had planned this together. Lauren didn't even flinch. She said they had given me time and that I had wasted it. My throat burned as I told her she had only given me conditions and shame. No one answered. I stood, my hands shaking, as I picked up the box. Without another word, I walked to the door, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. When it closed behind me, the silence followed me onto the porch. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be erased. That night, I checked into a cheap motel near the highway carrying the box, as though it held the last fragments of my identity. The walls were thin, the lights too bright, and the mattress stiff, but I held that box close to me like it might vanish if I let go. Sleep didn't come. The only thought circling through my mind was simple and sharp. They had really done it. My own family had pushed me out. I stared at the ceiling until the early hours, trying to convince myself I could find a way forward. That night marked the bottom of the descent, though I didn't know it yet. The next morning would bring an unexpected message that would change everything. The motel room was dim and unfamiliar, the kind of place where the curtains never quite closed, and the buzzing of the neon sign outside slipped through the cracks. I lay on top of the stiff mattress, my arms wrapped around the cardboard box Lauren had given me. I couldn't cry, though my chest ached with the weight of it all. The reality of what had happened circled my mind without rest. They had cast me out, and not one of them had spoken a word to stop it. Near midnight, I reached for my phone more out of habit than hope. The battery was nearly gone, but I connected to the motel's weak Wi-Fi and scrolled through emails. That was when I saw the subject line that made me sit up straighter. Henry Donovan Trust. Immediate attention required. My grandfather's name leapt off the screen. At first I thought it must be a mistake. No one had ever mentioned a trust. But the message was from a law firm in Madison, written by an associate attorney named Emily Carter. She explained that a provision in my grandfather's estate had been triggered by recent circumstances and urged me to contact their office right away. My hands shook as I read it again, hardly able to believe the words. Sleep didn't come after that. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, wondering what my grandfather could have possibly set aside. By morning, I was sitting on a bench outside a coffee shop phone pressed to my ear as I dialed the number in the email. Emily answered, her voice warm but steady, and asked me to confirm my identity. Once I did, she explained everything. The trust contained two key provisions. First, a small home in a town called Forest Hill had been deeded in my name, waiting for me alone. Second, a modest financial fund had been created to support my creative work. She went on to explain that my grandfather had arranged for the trust to remain sealed unless certain conditions were met. One of those conditions was me being removed from my family home without consent. Once that happened, the law firm was notified. I sat frozen, the words tumbling through my mind in pieces. A house, a fund, my name written on documents I had never known existed. Emily paused, then added softly that my grandfather had wanted me to have a way forward, a place where I could stand on my own. My throat tightened as I listened. He had known this day might come, even when I refused to see it. After the call ended, I sat on that bench for a long time, the noise of the city moving around me while I tried to catch my breath. For the first time in days, I felt something shift inside. The hopelessness that had wrapped itself around me loosened just enough to let in a flicker of light. My grandfather had not left me forgotten. He had left me a lifeline. 1 week later, I stood at the edge of a narrow gravel driveway in Forest Hill, holding a set of keys that trembled in my hand. The bungalow was small, tucked beneath tall pines that swayed in the late afternoon wind. The porch steps sagged with age, and the paint peeled in places, but when I turned the key and pushed the door open, the space felt different than anywhere I had ever lived. It was mine. The first night I slept on the wooden floor with nothing more than a borrowed blanket and a pillow. The house creaked around me like it was exhaling after years of holding its breath. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of that moment. No rules taped to the fridge, no silent judgment hanging in the air, no sister standing in the doorway waiting to criticize. Just space quiet and unbroken. The financial fund wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough to fix the roof that leaked during the first rain, enough to buy a used laptop and a sturdy desk, enough to breathe without the constant fear of bills piling up. More importantly, it was enough to write. I started small, creating a blog where I shared pieces I had been too nervous to show before. I wrote about silence, about shame, about what it felt like to be pushed out by people who were supposed to protect you. To my surprise, readers found me. Comments came in slowly at first, then more steadily, people saying they understood that they had lived through similar wounds. I realized I wasn't alone, and that realization steadied me more than anything else. When I submitted one of those pieces to a literary journal, I half expected the usual silence. Instead, a month later, I received an acceptance. I printed the email and taped it to the fridge. It wasn't much, but it was proof that my words mattered to someone beyond me. Lauren tried to reach out once, not directly, but through a letter from her firm. It was carefully worded, suggesting we review the trust and reestablish a cooperative understanding. I folded it back into the envelope and tucked it away. There would be no negotiation. My mother sent a birthday card with no return address. Inside was a short note and a small check, as if money could make up for silence. I left it untouched on a shelf. My father never reached out at all. Yet even without their voices, I didn't feel empty. I woke each morning to the sound of wind moving through the trees and opened my laptop to a blank page that felt more like home than the walls I had grown up in. I worked, I wrote, and I slowly pieced together a life that was my own. As the first snow of winter dusted the window ledge, I unpacked the leather journal my grandfather had given me on my 10th birthday. Inside the cover, his handwriting had faded with time, but was still legible. For Claire. May you never write to be accepted, only to be free. I traced the words with my fingertips, my chest filling with something steady and unshakable. I was no longer the girl standing on the porch holding a box of belongings while the door closed behind her. I was someone different now, building something that could never be taken from me. Most mornings in Forest Hill started the same. I brewed a pot of coffee, opened the curtains to let in the quiet gray light, and sat down at my desk by the window. The view wasn't much, just a patch of yard and the narrow street beyond, but there was peace in the stillness. I kept my focus on the blog. One post at a time, I shaped my voice into something clearer, less afraid. I wrote honestly about failure, rejection, and the soft ache of being overlooked. To my surprise, the words found people. The comment section slowly grew, filled with strangers who saw pieces of their own stories in mine. It made the small house feel less isolated. It reminded me that just because I'd been pushed aside didn't mean I was invisible. I used the fund my grandfather left to take a few online workshops, just enough to help me sharpen the edges of what I was building. The acceptance letter from the literary journal still hung on my fridge, the ink slightly faded from sunlight. It was the first thing I saw when I went to make tea or grab leftovers, a quiet reminder that I was still moving forward. About 2 months into living at the bungalow, I received another letter from Lauren's firm. This one was worded more carefully than the first. It referred to family realignment and clarifying the boundaries of the trust. It ended with a suggestion that we speak directly, just the two of us without lawyers. I sat with it for an afternoon, turning the envelope over in my hands. Then I placed it in the drawer beside my desk and didn't open it again. A week later, an email came through from a local bookstore I had been helping with social media. They were planning a small panel on emerging local writers and invited me to speak. I almost said no. The idea of sitting in front of a room full of people talking about my life felt too exposed. But then I remembered the nights I'd spent in silence, waiting for permission that never came. I said yes. The bookstore was tucked between a florist and a diner on Main Street. That evening, I wore a blue sweater I hadn't taken out of the closet in months and arrived 20 minutes early. The owner, a kind woman named Marlene, greeted me with a soft smile and showed me to a stool near the front. A folding table held a pitcher of water, some paper cups, and a stack of chapbooks from the other two speakers. When it was my turn to speak, my voice caught a little on the first line, but I kept going. I read a piece from my blog called "The Box at the Door," the one about the day I left my family's house with nothing but a cardboard box and the last of my pride. The room stayed quiet as I read, the kind of quiet that lets you know people are listening. Afterward, a few people came up to thank me. One woman, maybe in her 60s, told me her daughter had gone through something similar. A man around my age asked if I planned to publish a collection. I told him I hadn't thought about it, though the idea stayed with me on the drive home. That night, I sat on the front porch with a blanket over my shoulders, watching the pines shift gently in the wind. There was no traffic, no noise except the hum of insects and the distant creak of tree limbs settling in the cold. I thought about how long it had taken to get to that kind of stillness, and how hard I'd fought just to have it. A few days later, I gathered the courage to begin drafting a proposal for a larger writing project, something longer than blog entries, a memoir maybe. I sketched out the early structure, unsure of what it would become. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. I added it to a folder on my desktop labeled New Roots. Late that week, I received another envelope. This time, it came from my mother. There was no return address, but I recognized her handwriting on the front. Inside was a folded card and a single photograph. The card read, "Hope you're okay. I think about you every day." The photo was one I had never seen before. It was me, age 10, sitting beside my grandfather on the back porch, both of us laughing at something out of frame. I didn't know who had taken it or how she'd found it. I didn't cry. I just placed the card and photo beside the old journal he had given me, then closed the drawer. That weekend, I made a small change to the About section of my blog. I added my full name and a short bio. I no longer felt the need to hide behind initials or vague titles. I included my email address and a note saying I was available for freelance work. It was a small step, but it felt like lifting my voice just a little higher. The days began to stretch a little longer after that. Spring crept in slowly, softening the edges of winter. The bookstore invited me back for another reading, and this time I didn't hesitate. My follower count on the blog doubled after someone shared one of my essays on a larger platform. People started reaching out quiet messages of thanks, questions about healing notes from readers who had once been erased in their own ways. And through all of it, I never once responded to Lauren's letters. I didn't need to. The silence said more than words ever could. The house no longer felt like something I was borrowing. It felt earned. And though I hadn't yet said it out loud, I was beginning to understand what it meant to forgive, not to excuse, but to release. It was early April when I got the unexpected call. I was trimming dead branches from the hydrangea bushes near the porch, still wearing gloves and wiping my forehead with my sleeve, when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Sharon Klein, an estate administrator from the same law firm that had handled my grandfather's trust. Her tone was formal, but not cold. She explained that Lauren had filed a petition to review the terms of the trust. She was requesting mediation. I didn't speak right away, and Sharon let the silence stretch before adding that this type of review wasn't unusual when significant assets were involved. I could hear her flipping pages as she said it. I asked whether this meant Lauren was challenging the deed to the house or the fund my grandfather had set aside for me. Sharon paused, then told me Lauren was contesting the trigger clause, the part that activated the trust, only if I was removed from the family home. I told her I wasn't interested in mediation. Sharon said that was my right, but that if I declined, the next step might involve court. She asked if I had legal representation. I said no, not yet. After we hung up, I sat on the porch steps and stared at the yard for a long time. The daffodils I'd planted a few weeks earlier were just beginning to bloom. I looked out across the grass, then up at the pine trees that bordered the lot. The wind stirred the branches slowly, and for the first time in a while, I felt a quiet anger rising through the calm. Later that night, I opened the drawer with all the saved letters. Lauren's first letter, her firm's second attempt, and my mother's card with the photo, everything was still there. I laid them out on the dining table one by one. I read them again carefully, not to feel anything but to understand what I had missed. That's when I noticed a detail I hadn't paid attention to before. Lauren's first letter had referenced a mutual understanding that no longer existed. The second one emphasized that the trust had created an imbalance in the family. It was the language of someone who didn't regret what had been done, but resented that I had landed on my feet afterward. I called Sharon the next morning. I asked what Lauren's chances were realistically. She didn't give an answer at first, but eventually said that unless there was proof the trigger condition had been falsified, the trust would hold. I thanked her, then asked if there was anyone I could speak with for legal clarity, someone not affiliated with Lauren. She gave me a few referrals. By the end of that week, I had hired a small firm in Appleton that handled estate protections. I sent them everything: emails, documents, the official notice from Lauren's attorney. The lawyer who took my case was named Eric Monroe. He was measured experienced and didn't ask unnecessary questions. He reviewed everything carefully and said he wasn't worried. The trust was airtight. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear from Lauren directly, but I saw signs. A new friend request from someone with no mutual connections. A vague email that showed up in my spam folder with no signature. One afternoon, I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked down the street for nearly an hour before it pulled away. I didn't say anything to Eric, but I kept track. Spring warmed into early summer. The trees thickened with leaves, and the air took on that green, sweet smell that only lasts a few months. I kept writing. I turned one of my blog posts into a polished essay and submitted it to a regional magazine. It was accepted within 2 weeks. I started outlining chapters for a book proposal and pulled together sample pages. At the same time, Eric began preparing a formal response to the petition. He said we didn't need to escalate unless Lauren did. And so we waited. One afternoon in June, I drove into town to buy paint for the kitchen. I chose a soft sage color that reminded me of the notebooks my grandfather used to write in. When I returned, there was a manila envelope on my porch, not mailed, just left there. Inside was a letter from Lauren's attorney restating her intent to challenge the conditions of the trust. But it also included something else, a printed screenshot of a social media post I'd made 2 months earlier. It was from the bookstore, reading with a caption that read, "When I had nowhere to go, my grandfather gave me a second chance." Underneath it, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was the sentence, "We disagree with this version of events." I brought the envelope inside and placed it on the table. I didn't call Eric that night. I didn't even touch the letter again. Instead, I opened my laptop and began typing. I wrote until the sun went down, and then I wrote some more. It wasn't a blog post this time. It was the beginning of the book I had been circling around for months. I didn't name anyone. I didn't explain timelines or include legal phrasing. I just told the truth, what it felt like to be slowly erased, then quietly rebuild from the pieces. The next morning, I sent the photo of the envelope to Eric, along with a message. It was left on the porch. No return address. I'm ready to proceed if she is. He replied within the hour. Understood. We'll file our response by Monday. I sat on the porch that evening, a cup of tea in hand, the breeze lifting the edge of my notebook. The yard had grown greener than I remembered it being in spring. The daffodils had faded, but something stronger was beginning to take their place. Eric filed the formal response early Monday morning. By Wednesday, we received word that Lauren had withdrawn the petition entirely. There was no explanation attached, just a brief notice that she no longer intended to pursue legal action regarding the trust. Eric forwarded it to me with a short note that read, "This concludes our matter. Call if anything changes." I read that sentence twice, then once more, before finally letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about it or write anything that day. I just folded up the letter, slipped it into a plastic sleeve, and filed it in a box in the back of the closet. I wasn't afraid anymore, but I wasn't quite ready to look too closely at it either. The wind felt quiet, not like a victory, but like the closing of a door I wouldn't be reopening. That week, the kitchen painting project finally made it to the top of my to-do list. I pulled all the furniture into the center of the room, covered everything with drop cloths, and opened the windows to let in the early summer air. The sage green I'd chosen looked soft and clean on the walls, like the inside of a new notebook. With every stroke, it felt like I was erasing what had been left behind and filling the space with something clearer. At the end of the week, I received an email from the bookstore. They were hosting a summer lit series and wanted to feature my blog in a community newsletter. They also asked if I'd be willing to participate in a panel on narrative healing, whatever that meant. I agreed without hesitation. My voice didn't shake this time when I replied. The event took place in a community center behind the library. Folding chairs were set in neat rows, and the room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and paperbacks. I wore a dress I hadn't worn since college, something simple and soft that made me feel more grounded than dressed up. The panel included 2 other writers, both women in their 50s, who had published books about caregiving and late-in-life reinvention. We spoke about change, about silence, and about what it meant to speak when no one was listening. Afterward, a woman approached me. Her hair was silver and pulled back into a low braid, and she introduced herself as Janine. She said she'd read my blog after her daughter sent her a post called The House That Didn't Want Me. She paused, then said softly, "I wish I'd known how to be there for her. Your words helped me see what I missed. I didn't know how to respond right away, so I just nodded." She took my hand in hers, held it for a moment, then thanked me and walked away. On the drive home, I thought about what she'd said. I thought about all the things that had gone unsaid between me and my own mother. And somewhere between the highway and my neighborhood, I made the decision to call her. The phone rang 5 times before she answered. Her voice was uncertain, as if she hadn't expected to hear from me at all. I told her I was calling to let her know I was okay, that I was working, writing, building something. There was a pause on the other end, and then she said, "I'm glad, Claire." Her voice cracked a little when she said it. We didn't talk long. I didn't mention Lauren or the trust or the letter she'd sent with the photograph. I just asked how she was, and she said fine. We exchanged a few more words, then hung up. It wasn't closure, but it wasn't silence either. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a pen in hand writing in my grandfather's journal. I hadn't written in it for a while, just skimmed the pages when I needed a reminder of where I came from. But that night, the words came easily. I wrote about the first day in the bungalow, about the quiet creak of the floorboards and the way the light came in through the trees. I wrote about the cardboard box and the woman who had left it in front of me. I wrote about the long, slow climb that followed. It was the first time I had written it all in one place. The next morning, I printed the draft of my manuscript and set it on the desk beside my laptop. I still didn't know what would come of it, but it felt real in my hands, something complete, even if it still needed polish. I made a list of small presses and grant opportunities and added deadlines to my calendar. It was the kind of planning I used to think wasn't for people like me. A week later, I opened my email and found a message from Eric. It wasn't about the trust. He was checking in, just saying hello. He said it had been a pleasure working with me and that if I ever needed help again, I knew where to find him. I smiled, closed the laptop, and stepped outside. The garden was full by then. The herbs had spread past their planters, and the early tomatoes were finally starting to turn. I crouched down to tie up a vine that had started to lean too far, and as I worked, I thought about all the ways my grandfather had helped me plant this life quietly, carefully, and with faith I hadn't always deserved. And though the road to this moment had started with silence, it had led me here where everything finally felt like mine. That summer evening, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, I sat on the back steps with a glass of cold tea and watched the light shift across the garden. The breeze was soft, and the porch boards creaked under me in that familiar, comforting way. I'd lived in this house for almost a year now, but it had started to feel like home much earlier than that, quietly without ceremony, like the way the first frost fades, or the way pages turn on their own in a breeze. The legal mess with Lauren was over. No more letters, no more distant calls from lawyers, no more reminders of who had cast me out and who had stayed silent. The trust held. The house stayed mine. The fund, modest but steady, kept me going long enough to find my footing. And the writing, it was still here, still saving me one page at a time. I had no idea if Lauren felt regret or if she ever looked back at what she'd done. I no longer needed to know. My mother had written once more, just a note this time folded into a blank card with a pressed daisy inside. It said, "I hope you're well. I think of your grandfather every day." I didn't reply, but I tucked it next to the old journal he'd given me. It didn't feel like forgiveness, not yet, but it didn't sting the way it used to. A few weeks later, I got an email from a small publisher. They were interested in my manuscript. Said it felt honest, needed, and deeply human. I read the message twice, then walked outside barefoot and let the grass steady me. I wasn't sure if this was the beginning of something big or just the quiet reward for having kept going. Either way, it felt like enough. One morning, I pulled the journal from the drawer and opened to the very first page. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still there. For Claire, may you never write to be accepted, only to be free. I ran my fingers over the letters, then closed the book and held it against my chest. It had taken me years to understand what that sentence truly meant. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that house on Hazelwood Drive. I don't expect apologies anymore, and I've stopped trying to rewrite the parts of my life that others chose to skip over. What I do know is this: there's a kind of peace that comes when you no longer ask to be invited in. When you build something of your own and let it grow without needing anyone else to water it. And maybe that's the justice we don't talk about enough, not revenge, not reversal. Just the quiet reclaiming of your space in the world. If you've ever had to start over with nothing but your own voice, I hope you know it's enough. It really is. Thanks for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know. Share it, save it, or just sit with it a while. We all carry more than we show, and sometimes telling the story is the first step home.